Hello, my name is Caitlin Millen, and today's webinar is called Self-Determination, Expand Your Toolbox. The beginning code for today's webinar is SELF, S-E-L-F. So I'll just start out by introducing myself. My name is Caitlin Millen, and I'm the Director of Deaf Education Programming at the Maine Educational Center for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing and the Governor Baxter School for the Deaf. A little bit about more about my background includes that I have worked for the past 17 years in a variety of settings with students who are deaf or hard of hearing, including students who use listening and spoken language, American Sign Language, total communication settings. I went for my master's in education of the deaf at Smith College in Massachusetts, and then I worked for several years as a teacher of the deaf out there. I started summer camps for students who are deaf or hard of hearing in Massachusetts and in Colorado. And then I went for my PhD in special education at the University of Northern Colorado, which was focused on students who are deaf or hard of hearing and self-determination. So those areas are really my areas of passion, and I'm so excited to share with you about that today. Excuse me. More recently, I worked as a postdoctoral researcher focused on self-determination at the University of Kansas, and now I'm in Maine. Okay, so today's agenda includes an overview of self-determination definitions, components, and skills, and as well as an overview of research on self-determination, deaf and hard of hearing specific examples. So what does self-determination look like in students who are deaf or hard of hearing? Self-determination interventions. So how can we actually work on self-determination skills? Assessments, how can we then assess those skills and determine progress? Then we'll talk about sample IEP goals and objectives and data collection. And then finally, some resources. Okay, so this is the more formal definition of self-determination, and I'll just give you a moment to read it. So self-determination is essentially one's ability to take actions towards one's own self-chosen goals. So not goals that someone else set for an individual, but goals that they set for themselves, that they chose. The components of self-determined behavior include choice making. So that could be as simple as choosing what to wear in the morning, decision making. So thinking about multiple different options, for example, what to do after after high school, and making a decision, coming to a decision. Problem solving. So, what to do, for example, if you're having trouble getting to class on time, how do you solve that problem? Goal setting. So setting a goal, again, that the individual has chosen, and then working towards attaining or reaching that goal. Self-monitoring. There are actually a lot of really cool ways to do that. So it could be, for example, if a student has test scores from week to week, they can graph their own scores, or they can basically collect their own data, graph their own data, and then that can be a great tool for developing self-awareness. So they can take a look at their graph of their scores and use that as a reflection tool and think about, okay, why was my score higher this week and lower this week? What was different? And that can develop self-awareness, which is another component on here. And self-advocacy is a skill that we talk a lot about in our field. So that ability of an individual to advocate for their own needs, to speak up and say, hey, this is something I need. And then finally, self-knowledge. So really having a good understanding of one's own strengths, areas of need, preferences, etc. So here are some examples of what it looks like in students who, or what it could look like in students who are deaf or hard of hearing. So self-awareness could look like understanding one's own hearing loss, communication implications, understanding their hearing equipment, choice making. So it could be choosing preferred activities. So maybe that could be extracurricular activities and then how they might communicate with peers in those activities. Problem solving could look like troubleshooting hearing equipment, figuring out what to do when figuring out what to do when it's difficult to hear. Self-advocacy could look like asking for captioned media, asking for repetition or clarification. Self-monitoring could look like students monitoring their own progress. So I talked about one way of quantitative data collection and graphing it. Another way could be more of a narrative reflection of one's own progress. So for example, say a student wants to improve skills in basketball outside of school, they could monitor their own progress with that and write about what they've done well or what their strengths are and maybe what they need to work on. Goal setting. So it could be in a lot of different areas: academics, extracurriculars, self-advocacy, transition skills. If you have students who are at that older age, or high school age, and finally self-efficacy, believing in oneself, which we'll talk a little bit more about later. So why develop self-determination skills? There is a wide body of research supporting the need for working on self-determination skills. Research has shown that self-determination skills can result at the end of high school in higher rates of community involvement, employment with benefits, and independent living. And then it's also, self-determination skills are also a predictor of in-school and post-school success. So these are such crucial lifelong skills that really all students need. And it's all about opportunities. So you can think of self-determination kind of like a muscle. Like you see the image here with the child with these big muscles. So you can think about it like exercising a muscle. So, if you want to have strong muscles, you need to do exercises every day to strengthen those muscles. Self-determination skills are much like that. So people need daily practice to work on these skills. Every day, throughout the day, opportunities to work on these skills will help strengthen them. So there is very little research on self-determination in students who are deaf or hard of hearing. That's an area of need with research, which was part of why that was my focus and interest. So it has been identified as a need that students who are deaf or hard of hearing really need these skills. And we recently conducted a study where we looked at friendships and self-determination, and we found a significant positive correlation between self-determination scores and both the quality and quantity of friendships in students. This doesn't mean a causal relationship, so we don't know if one causes another or not. But we do know that they're correlated, that these skills are related and they're both needed and important for students. Research that is in the works, but it has probably will be published in the next year or so, includes research using a new measure of self-determination called the Self-Determination Inventory Student Report, and there is an American Sign Language version of it. So we have some studies that are coming out looking at the data from students who are deaf or hard of hearing who use that self-determination inventory, the ASL version. So that will be coming, but it's not out yet. Excuse me. So when I was at the University of Northern Colorado, I conducted a study with colleagues there where we did a systematic review of replicative self-determination intervention studies. And we analyzed any intervention study. So that's like where research where they were looking at actually working on self-determination skills, any study on that topic in the last 10 years. And we found that there were no intervention studies in several of the IDEA disability categories. And you see here hearing impairment, and that's really because that's the current IDEA label, but I recognize that is students who are deaf or hard of hearing. So there are no intervention studies in that area. That other category includes maybe unspecified disability, other areas like math anxiety, maybe they didn't report disabilities. And so that was that other category that's so high, but you can see that there's really a need for the field to kind of embrace self-determination as something that we need to work on and with students and also research more. So the national employment rates and educational and attainment rates show gaps between deaf and hearing people. So here are the national employment rates as well as educational attainment rates. And again, this really comes back to opportunities. So there are many students the majority of students who are deaf or hard of hearing have an IEP, an individualized education program. And that oftentimes includes support services from teachers of the deaf, OT, PT, speech and language pathologists, etc. So you think about all these support services, which are great at supporting the student. However, when you get more adults who are involved with that student's education, there is a tendency for adults to kind of want to take over and help a lot or too much. So if you think about an example of if a student is in a general ed inclusive classroom and they have a teacher who is using videos that are not captioned, it is very tempting for one of the adults working with that student to jump in and go to that gen ed teacher and say, hey, you need to make sure your videos are captioned. This student needs this. But in doing that, that is actually that is a great opportunity for that adult to actually take a step back and instead give that opportunity to the student to work on self-advocacy skills. So coaching and working with that student on what can you say with the teacher, what can you talk about with the teacher, what can you say to that teacher to assertively advocate for yourself in a respectful way. So how can you, so in that situation, that student can work on self-advocacy skills. So that's just an example of opportunities and really rethinking our everyday interactions with students and how we can shift those to take a step back and put students in the driver's seat a little bit more. So there are quite a few different self-determination interventions, and these are designed for students more broadly, so not specifically for students who are deaf or hard of hearing. And there's one in particular that I want to highlight, which is the last one on here. It's called the SDLMI, or the Self-Determined Learning Model of Instruction. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit, but I wanted to highlight that because it is an evidence-based intervention, meaning that there is a wide body of research now supporting that intervention. Okay, so some deaf and hard of hearing specific self-determinations include these resources here, and there are QR codes if you want to pull up your phone or iPad and go right to these websites, you're more than welcome to do that and check these out. So the first one is called the Map It Transition Curriculum. So that is primarily for older deaf and hard of hearing students to work on transition skills. So that's more geared towards them. And then another resource also a little bit more geared towards like middle high school age students is self-advocacy for students who are deaf or hard of hearing. So this is a whole curriculum on self-advocacy, and it's a great resource. The link on here is to the Success for Kids with Hearing Loss website. And on this page, if you go to this link, if you scroll all the way to the bottom of the page, there is a link to a PDF of each chapter of this curriculum. And on that same page, there are a ton of other great resources that you can check out while you're on there. And then finally, the last resource I listed on here is the Guide to Access Planning, which is by Phonak. And that's another great tool. Another self-determination intervention is called Deaf First. So this was developed by the National Deaf Center on Post-Secondary Outcomes. And it's a game that they can play online, and it's actually all accessible in American Sign Language, which is really cool. And it's kind of like one of those choose your own adventure games where students are posed with scenarios, and they have to select what they want to choose, and then it sends them in different directions based on their selections. So they're real life challenges, and the purpose is that this game is for students to have fun and work on self-determination skills. And that's available at deaffirst.com, and the QR code to link to that is on here. So just a fun fact about Deaf First is that they did a contest to come up with a sign name for Deaf First, and they had students from all over submit entries, and they selected one, and it looks like this: Deaf First. So it's kind of like going on your own adventure. And so that's a great resource as well. Okay, so the SDLMI, or the Self-Determined Learning Model of Instruction. This is available on the Kansas University Center on Developmental Disabilities website, self-determination.org, and the QR code is linked here if you want to pull it up. And so I'll explain a little bit more about what the SDLMI is. So it's a teaching model that enables teachers to teach students basically about self-determination skills, making choices and decisions, monitoring their progress, adjusting their goal or plan. And it's an iterative goal-setting process. So there are 3 phases, and the first phase is, what is my goal? So students set a goal for themselves, and within each of these phases, there are different questions that students are prompted with. So the next phase is, what is my plan? So then they come up with a plan for working towards their goal. And finally, what have I learned? So taking time to reflect, adjust the goal or plan, and then they start over again and either set a new goal, or they adjust their goal and go back to phase 2. So this is just an iterative process that they can work through. And it's based on this framework that includes decide, act, believe. So this is the self-determined action framework. And decide is essentially using strengths and areas of need to identify goals and choosing goals based on one's vision for the future. Act is really about taking action. So thinking about how can they problem solve, work through different barriers to work towards their goals. And then believe is that self-efficacy component that we talked about earlier. So feeling empowered to take action, really believing that they can work towards their goals. and then also knowing their strengths and areas of needs. Okay, so there was a study conducted a couple of years ago where student reflections on their experiences with the SDLMI were analyzed, and here are just a few quotes from that study. So students said things like, "I know I'm going to reach my goal because I'm trying. I would do it again. It helped me. And I made progress on my goal because I tried to." So these were just some of the things that students said about the SDLMI. And as I mentioned, this is just one intervention to work on self-determination. There are many, and I just highlighted this one in particular because there is a wide body of research to support it. Okay, another idea for to work on with students that I want to highlight is summer camps and social programs. And I know that so many of these are on hold right now because of COVID. Camps across the world were canceled, and social programs have been a lot more challenging in this environment. However, I've seen a lot of social programs for students who are deaf or hard of hearing go virtual. So they had Zoom meetups. So there are still ways to connect with one another, and hopefully we can get back to that in-person connection in the future. But this is just to, again, we don't know if there's a causal relationship between friendships and self-determination, but we do know that they're both important, and that giving students that opportunity to connect with other students who are deaf or hard of hearing and really understand that experience is so crucial. The 87% of students who are deaf or hard of hearing are included in general ed mainstream settings at least part of the day. And oftentimes they might be the only student with hearing loss in their class or perhaps their entire school. So that having that opportunity to connect with other students who get it, who understand what their experience is like, is so crucial. So I just want to highlight that as another consideration. Self-determination assessments. So again, there are quite a few different options of assessments, and there are not really any formal, widely produced assessments for elementary and early childhood yet, but that is something that folks are working on. There is one particular assessment that I want to highlight, which is the last bullet point on there, called the Self-Determination Inventory Student Report. And the reason why I want to highlight that is because there is an American Sign Language version. And also it is designed to align with the SDLMI, that self-determined learning model of instruction, which is an evidence-based intervention. So that is, those two reasons are why I want to highlight this particular assessment. And also it's really super quick. Many of the assessments are more lengthy. So this one is 21 items and it takes about 15 minutes for students to complete. It's been validated for adolescents with and without disabilities, ages 13 to 22, and it has a variety of online accessibility features. It's available on self-determination.org, and you can use the QR code to pull up the link if you want. And here's just a screenshot of what that homepage for the ASL version looks like with the interpreter. So I'll talk a little bit more about that. So here's a sample item. It's a little difficult to read, but it says, "I consider many possibilities when I make plans for my future." So that is an example of one item, and then students are prompted for each item to move a sliding bar from disagree to agree. And on the back end, it translates to a score. But basically, they move this sliding bar to respond about their perceptions of their own skills and abilities. There is, on On the intro page, as well as for each item, there's an ASL video with controls. There are in-text definitions for more challenging words. So you might see some words that are underlined, and you can hover the mouse over that and it pops up with a definition of that word, which is pretty cool. There's a progress bar showing the completion status at the top, as well as the gradient that shows, when you move that sliding bar, and then a check mark to indicate that the student has responded to that item. At the end of completing that survey, students get a score report, and there's a video on ASL explaining what the report means. You can save it with or without the scores. So there are numerical scores ranging from 0 to 100 for each of those areas. This screenshot does not show the numerical scores. However, you can save it with the scores if you want. What's kind of cool about this is you can use this as data collection and have students complete this maybe at the beginning of the school year, middle of the school year, and end of the school year, so you can monitor progress. And then below that score, below this, so the second part of the screen here is this part. So it gives a breakdown of what decide, act, and believe mean, and the skills that are associated with each of those areas. So for example, believe is about feeling empowered to reach your goals, and it includes self-awareness and self-knowledge. And then at the bottom, you can see that there's a blue highlighted text there that says SDI guide PDF. Working at home. SDI guide PDF. So you can click on that and get access to the report guide. So that actually gives an even more detailed breakdown of decide, act, believe, all of the skills and abilities, and then it breaks down even more how you can work on some of those areas. So this is that report guide that I was just mentioning, just a few pages from it. Okay, so another opportunity for working on self-determination skills is student involvement in the IEP process. There are resources out there for what's called the student-led or student-facilitated IEP, when the student is leading the process more or facilitating the process. And that is just an awesome opportunity for students to work on self-determination skills. But just remember that it's one opportunity, and self-determination is a muscle. Those skills are kind of like a muscle that need to be exercised and used and practiced on a daily basis. So this is one opportunity to do that. Okay, so there are not as many resources out there for working on self-determination in early childhood. However, those skills are crucial across the lifespan, and we need to be starting working on self-determination skills at a young age and not waiting until high school to start thinking about it. So it's not just a transition topic, it's a topic across the lifespan. So some areas for working on self-determination in early childhood include goal setting, which could be, for example, potty training, self-feeding, choice making. So for example, letting a child choose what clothes to wear in the morning, or maybe if you're in a preschool classroom and they have centers, they can choose which activity that they want to participate in. So that's an example of, in a preschool setting, working on giving students the opportunity to work on self-determination skills. Problem solving. So again, it's so easy as an adult to swoop in and want to clean up the whole mess yourself, but that's a chance where you can pause and say, hey, you spilled your milk. What do you think you could do to clean it up, and give the child a chance to think about it and to problem solve. And I've had some teachers and parents ask me, like, what do I do if I have a student or a child who I ask them if to make a choice, or I give them choices to make, or, I try and prompt them to problem solve and they're just not responding, or they can't make a choice. Start out with modeling. So for example, choice making. If you have a child who shows up to preschool, has a hard time choosing an activity, you can model it. So you can say, well, there's the water station over here, and I love water, so I might think about learning a little bit more about how water works. Or there's this other sand station over here, and so you can kind of talk out loud and model that thought process of making a choice and then say, I think I'll choose this. And so you can start out by modeling these skills to start out. If you have children who are having a tough time working on those skills, and then you can eventually bridge to, okay, now it's your turn, and until they're able get at the point where they can do those skills themselves. Self-monitoring. So there's an image on here that says rate yourself, and it gives examples of what green, yellow, or red mean. So green might mean I tried really hard. Yellow might mean I tried some of the time, or red might mean I didn't try, or I didn't do my best. So even children at a young age can rate themselves in self-monitoring and work on those skills. Okay, so over several years, a colleague and I worked with teachers in Massachusetts who were using the SDLMI, the Self-Determined Learning Model of Instruction, with students, and it was district-wide. So transition in high school all the way down to preschool. And the elementary school teachers were looking for some kind of assessment, and there just wasn't one out there, so they created one. And what's awesome is that they gave me permission to share it. So on this page is a QR code, and the website, it's actually on the Success for Kids with Hearing Loss site. So if you go to this specific page on their site on self-determination, there are links to those PDFs of the reflection forms that they developed on there if you want to download those. So you can use those for students to monitor their own progress with self-determination skills. So those students could use elementary students could use the SDLMI, and then you might need to adjust some of the questions to be more appropriate for their language level. But students, and you can feel free to make those adjustments for those students. And then they can assess themselves using these tools. So green, yellow, red for each of those items. Another example of an assessment specific to self-advocacy is this Can SelfDetermination Checklist. And it's on the PHONAC website, as well as in Karen English's self-advocacy for students who are deaf or hard of hearing curriculum. This was developed by Cheryl DeCon Johnson and Carrie Spangler. And they are both, and it's a little bit more oriented towards students who use listening and spoken language. So if you work with students who primarily use ASL, you might want to not use some sections, or maybe adjust some of the questions so that they're more appropriate for the students that you work with. But this can be a great pre-post assessment. And this is the first page of it, and then the second page. And it says I can, and you check off if they can or can't. How I have used it in the past is I have given partial credit if they partially have that skill. So like a 0 0.5 or 1, like 0 aren't able to do it yet. So that would be like not checked off. 0.5 partially, 1 would be like, yes, they've got this skill. So that's a way that you could score it. And I actually used this with a colleague, and I used this at a summer camp for students who are deaf or hard of hearing in Colorado. And so here's just an example of how we collected data and reported on that at this particular camp. So the camp was designed to work on self-advocacy skills. And we used only 10 items from that checklist. You can see that that checklist was pretty long. And so we just selected 10 items that we wanted to focus on for this camp because it was only a week-long camp. And we assess students at the beginning of camp. So we ask them questions like, oh, can you describe your hearing loss? Can you tell me about your hearing equipment, et cetera? So we did that assessment and gave them 0, 0.5, or 1 point for each of those 10 items. So they had a 0 to 10 score before camp. And then at the end of camp, we assessed them again. So you can see for it on the bottom, it says 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all the way up to 8. So that was for each student. There were 8 students in this sample, and their scores before camp in blue and after camp in red. So this is just one example of how you could have, for example, in IEP, a goal to work on self-advocacy skills, and then use that I Can checklist as a pre and post assessment, and you can collect data and report on their progress with those skills. So another example for IEPs is this resource that is going to be available soon. It's not quite available yet, but it should be available soon on the self-determination.org website. So again, there's that QR code here, and that's just to the site in general because that particular resource isn't quite available yet. It will be soon. But this is a resource that was developed as to provide example IEP goals and objectives of how you could take the SDISR, the Self-Determination Inventory Student Report, and use that to inform developing IEP goals and objectives. So they actually gave me permission to share the examples from that resource. Even the resource itself will be available soon, but this is a snapshot of what it looks like in the resource. So it begins with the student profile of a fictitious student, Isabella, and she is a 15-year-old Latinx student in 10th grade, has an IEP, has 4 siblings, and highly values family. She loves math, is a member of a coding club for young women, enjoys mentoring younger students, and her dream is to work as a programmer at Google. So this is just kind of her, we started with the student profile because, you know, we never want to be copying and pasting IEP goals and objectives and we want to first be thinking about who is the student, what are their strengths and areas of need, and then working with them to set those goals and objectives. So here is an example, again, a fictitious student, Isabella's SDISR report, or student score report. So self-determination inventory student report scores. So her greatest strength is an ACT, and which involves identifying different ways to navigate around barriers as she works towards her goals. And then there are 2 areas for growth: decide, which is knowing strengths and areas of need and setting goals, and then believe, feeling empowered to reach her goals. So those are more areas of need for her. So an example of a decide IEP goal might be, I will present my strengths, support needs, and goals related to a career during my IEP meeting. So that could be a student-led IEP meeting. You can see that it has an I statement. So the student is writing her goals and objectives. So you can work with students on this to have them, to put them in their driver's seat more, to set their own goals and objectives. And then, so objectives associated with that goal are listed here, and I'll just give you a moment to read those. Okay, and then here another example is in the ACT domain. So what an ACT goal, IEP goal might look like could be, for Isabella, could be, I will increase my writing skills in English so that I will be able to write a cohesive 2-page college essay by the end of the school year. So this is kind of linking back to that overall dream of becoming a programmer for Google. And she has strengths in math, and writing is an area of need for her. So that's an example of an ACT goal. And then the associated objectives could look like this. And I'll give you just a moment to read these. Okay, moving on to believe. So this is the final area where I'm going to provide an example IEP goal. And again, this is working on self-awareness and self-knowledge. And a goal might be, I will expand my support network to increase my exposure to role models and peer supports to achieve my dream of becoming a programmer for Google. And objectives could look like this, and I'll give you a moment to read these. Okay, and the final part of these IEP goal and objectives that I want to talk about is starting to think about the students with whom you work, and how you might incorporate self-determination into their IEP. So what I would love for you all to do is pause the video and take a few minutes to write down, think about one of your students in particular, and think about how they might work on self-determination, and write a sample IEP goal and a set of objectives for that particular student. And again, when you really want to be working collaboratively with students to work on writing IEPs, but for the sake of practicing, working on thinking about really how you would put this into practice, take a moment and write a sample IEP goal and set of objectives. So take a few minutes to do that right now, and go ahead and pause the video. Okay, so I am going to wrap up today's talk by bringing up one super important topic within this, which is, what about the parents and guardians? You know, we're talking about school contexts, and so that school district that I mentioned that we worked with in Massachusetts, we conducted a study where I interviewed teachers who were working with students on self-determination skills, and I interviewed them about their experiences. I didn't have any questions about families, parents, guardians, etc. And one of my questions was, what challenges have you faced in working on self-determination with students? And almost every teacher talked about parents and families. And this is not to say that, parents didn't want their children to work on self-determination, or that they were trying to oppose teachers or anything like that. It really came down to not being on the same page. And we found that out by conducting a follow-up study in which we interviewed parents in that same district about their experiences working on self-determination with their children. I generally ask them about their experiences in a similar way that I ask the teachers. And almost all of them talked about how they felt like they didn't really know what was going on in the school, even though there was this district-wide implementation of the SDLMI. They didn't feel like they had a good understanding of what self-determination was, what was happening in the school related to self-determination. They also didn't feel like they had a good understanding of what they could do to work on the skills. The parents are with their kids more than teachers are. So this is such a crucial component, because in this particular example, that what the parents were doing at home was actually conflicting with what the teachers were trying to do in the school. So getting on the same page as families is such an important part of this process. Sharing about research on self-determination and what it is, and maybe how they can work on it at home. And I think the biggest challenge that teachers talked about was trying to get in touch with families, which, I know it can be challenging, and you might have to use different strategies for reaching out to different parents. But just finding some way to connect with them and get on the same page is such an important part of this process. Thank you so much for joining today. I really appreciate having some time to talk with you all about self-determination with students who are deaf or hard of hearing. The end code for this webinar is determination. And my contact information is here. It's caitlin.millen@gmail.com. If you are ever looking for resources, if you want to bounce around ideas, if you have questions, etc., please reach out to me. I'd love to hear from you, and I'm always happy to talk about different resources and ideas. So thank you so much, and have a wonderful day.